I think you all might be thinking, why is the talk having this kind of a strange title? Things I did and wished I didn't have to do in the game industry. But we'll have a little bit of a story, and then I'll tell you a little bit about that. Now, I started in Singapore, actually. That was back in 2008 or so. Did game dev, of course. Started at National University of Singapore. Did an internship. Came over to Ubisoft Singapore. Worked on Skull and Bones. Worked on Ghost Recon Phantoms. So went from basic game design. Started working in spreadsheets. Then started getting introduced to monetization. Came over to Sweden. That was back in 2016. Worked on live service with DICE. So at that point, it was Battlefront 2. Talking about Battlefield 5, 2042. And now I'm working with Mojang. And that's where I wanted to figure out, what's it like to have an evergreen title? And then I realized, hey, there's this new thing on the scene called AI. That was interesting, but didn't know what to make of it. But this is where the story begins. Now, back in the day, we were working with spreadsheets, a whole bunch. In fact, I think some of you might still be doing it today. What could possibly go wrong with spreadsheets? Well, it turns out this was basically my first assignment when I was working within the game industry. I was supposed to get this spreadsheet into the server. No errors, of course. You're just going to enter the data directly. But there was a slight problem. The tool didn't work quite right. So if I had to get the thing into the server through the web tool, it wasn't really getting in that easily. It was a lot of manual work. But remember, nobody supported this tool. It's proprietary. It's within the game, as in within the company. And it's been deprioritized. All right. Well, then I was thinking, OK, maybe I have to massage things into the server. It takes some effort. But how do I even query this thing within a database? And the spreadsheets, they didn't really match the database. And how do you get the information out? So just think about this resulted in a whole bunch of late days, 9 p.m. That's pretty common back then. But what's really fun is when you start looking at the tool chain. Now, those numbers over there are basically all different steps that we had to go through. It's like we went from the database, we go into the exports, we pop things into the local machine, try to parse things out, go to the CSV into the Excel, and round trip the thing. So there's a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on. And remember, at that point, I was a junior game designer, so I didn't actually know a lot of this stuff. But the challenge at that point was this. We needed to ship on Steam. And to do so, we needed to get 40 weapons up on launch. But here's the problem. There was only about 1 month remaining. And at the time, using the tool, it took like 3 days to get one single weapon in. So it doesn't math, because what's happening here is you're dealing with basically months of work. You have 1 month remaining, and no amount of overtime is going to save us from this. So remember, one of the things that when I joined the industry, I didn't even know Excel at first. But I got better because you had to figure this kind of stuff out. And it was a proprietary tool. There was no support for it. And the other thing is, there were so many different tools and data files, and each one was a possible point of failure. So the human error, you can imagine, is huge in this kind of setup. But the diffs were done with the freaking Mark I eyeball. Now, you have to just look at every single cell and figure out if the data was right. And very few knew the data, and this was actually a serious problem. It's not something to brag about, because knowing how to do this well doesn't actually make you a better game designer or a game developer. It just makes you really good at reading spreadsheets. But these days, there are so many opportunities because of language models, especially when you're talking about generative AI. At the time, I would have been really, really happy if we had a chance to have tutorialization, figuring out just how was this stuff supposed to work, because nobody really had it all together. We had to keep asking different developers about it. Documentation assistance. Sometimes documentation is just out of date, and you need to make sure that stuff is properly updated. And these days, if you're talking about running even ChatGPT, you have assisted script creation. So you can basically say, I need a toy script done up. If you know what you're doing, you know what to expect, you can get them done really, really quickly. And the other beautiful thing, natural language diffs. And you can just do your reviews just by checking the model. And another thing that's really useful is sometimes, initially when we're trying to set the data up, we want the data structure in. But if you don't actually understand it and there's nobody to advise, it's actually a solved problem. Other people have done this, and we can do that. And of course, anomaly and error detection. If there's a fault, you can request a diff between the two, and you can get an output. And then you think, okay, that's great. So we've been in the industry, and I'm telling you a story from over 10 years ago. And then after you're talking about live service, you're doing itemization. After 10 years, everything has been fixed in the game industry. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out that even in the modern day, items need metadata. And all the metadata, especially if you're putting it in the game engine, they're going to be buried in the menus. And then you've got this error chance here. So you can just calculate it yourself. Just think about it. You've got the metadata, you've got the menu depth, and then you have an item count. You multiply that all together, and you tell me what the error rate is supposed to look like. And the question again is, what could possibly go wrong in this case? Well, it turns out when you have local caches. So imagine that you have data. You pop in the game engine, it's past version control, and you're like, good, the build is solid, we don't have any problems with the build whatsoever, except if you have a local cache. What's a local cache? You have data that resides on the server, but to optimize, sometimes you have it down in your local client. Okay, but what happens when they don't match? Especially if you're supposed to send a version out there and the cherry pick was incomplete. So what you're saying here is that I have made 20 changes, 18 of them have gone across. There are 2 of them that we don't know about. What could possibly go wrong there? Well, it goes over to the test build, and the QA comes up and says, hey, remember that thing you just did? It's not there. What do you mean it's not there? I'll test it. It's not there. And I'm like, no, I reproduced it. It worked on the machine. Okay, let me just update from the server. Let's try it again. It's still not working. What the heck's going on? Turns out, if your local cache is actually diffing from what's on your server, you have a horrible situation, because you've got human errors, you get it mixed in with what comes out from the cherry pick, where the build engineer is just picking your changes. They don't really know what you did, so they put 18 out of 20 in there, and you cannot reproduce the error, so you test it, and it just goes nowhere. So back again, Mark 1 eyeball. The freaking thing, you got to review it again. And this is a problem that's been around 15 years, and I'm pretty sure it's still haunting some of you today. So one of the things that's really kind of cool is that we have opportunities today to break the tool chain. When people talk about generative AI, often they're talking about, oh, let's make some graphics, let's make some videos, let's make all the beautiful stuff. And I say, let's do some boring things. Because what happens here is you're looking at a new program, you're looking at a tool, it's what I would call a knowledge tractor. So remember in the past, often when people talk about labor, it's like, oh yeah, we'll have a machine, the machine will do the human labor, and now you need fewer people to do it. But nowadays, you have an ability to have a machine do knowledge work, and you can offload a whole bunch of this busy work over to the machine. Now, another opportunity here is you can just basically be tracking the flow of changes, because sometimes you go, oh, there's so many changes, your build engineers all cross-eyed. You can track that. You can actually see where the changes are. You can get them flagged up with arbitrary rules that don't necessarily exist in your enterprise software or your version control solution. And next up, reducing that kind of dependency on the Mark 1 eyeball. You get cross-eyed eventually. If you just keep looking at data, just trying to compare them one by one, eventually you're going to miss stuff. And then when you miss stuff, that means even more time fixing bugs. You don't really want to do that. And the next thing is, especially the one that I could never do, which was the offline cache anomaly detection. What if your cache does not sync with the server? How do you know that? There's no way for you to review the whole thing. It makes no sense. You must just try to pull the new thing across. But how do you know that the new thing across is in sync now? We don't necessarily know. And that would be really useful to be able to call that out. And of course, next up is, of course, structuring and autofilling metadata, because imagine there's so many data fields. You need to fill them all in, and you need to do it right, and you need to not miss a bunch of entries. It's really tedious. What do you want to do? Auto-flag, just say, you're not going to pass this across. There's anomalies in the stuff you're putting in. That's what can be spotted. Now, when I talk about AI, people will go, oh yeah, so you're talking about ChatGPT. No, not really, because this is not actually new tech. You can think of it as machine learning as a subset of AI. We have been using this in game dev for decades, literally decades, because all your rule-based systems, pretty much your finite state machines, that's a subset, but very, very rudimentary, very, very simple. And then later on, with machine learning and the hybrid models, you start having some kind of recommender systems. You start having the stuff that you actually use with your phones. So on a daily basis, if you're going on Google search, if you go on Amazon, you go on YouTube, you go anywhere else, all that stuff is basically powered by AI to an extent. And then, of course, now we have the super visual, now we have generative AI, we have models that allow us to use text as input. And actually, that's where things get really, really interesting. And that's actually why, at this point, there's so much attention on generative AI. Because at this point, you've got natural language, you can just talk to it effectively, and you can get a meaningful output. But when you have natural language input for programs, the important thing you need to get is basically comprehensible reasoning. And in fact, that kind of transparency is not very clear right now, because when you put something through a language model, you get an output, you don't necessarily understand how the output was formulated. So as a result, it becomes very difficult to figure out, like, is this something that I can trust? But one of the good things is there's a natural language refinement of the output. If you're able to actually verify what's on that, you look at it and you go, doesn't seem quite right. You can ask for a refinement of it, but you need to be an expert. You need to know what's over there. And of course, one of the things that's coming up is people are actually starting to use natural language to code. But that becomes a question of what other applications could you potentially have using generative AI? Well, the most obvious one, of course, is let's skip the work. It's tempting. Let's say you want to write an article, boom, language model gives it out. It's terrible, because this particular article was just saying, hey, how are you going to make $1.2 million in 6 months? I say, yeah, sure, win the lottery. You can do that. But the reality is, this article was clearly generated, it made no sense, and then I punched it through ChatGPT, of course. And then it was like, yeah, it's well written, but it makes zero sense. And I agree with that, because that's not the way the models should be used. A couple of ways that you could use them. Right now, for example, I have a design proposal. I was suggesting maybe you can do a couple things. And what do you think, model? What do you think the output would be like? And they go, OK, here's a critique of the design you have. And I'll say, all right, sure, do it again. So I ask for more details effectively. And what's interesting, even though you cannot read the text down there, it's obviously going to be too small, but it mentioned griefing and trolling. And I was thinking, oh, that's very nice, because nobody usually mentions that kind of stuff unless you are talking with a human and they're like, oh yeah, I'm experienced with games and gamers, and we know that gamers will always be trolling. This was basically one of the ways that you can run ideation and just iterate there. And I always talk about iteration at 12 midnight, because you are trying to consult with someone else, and it's 12 midnight, nobody's going to answer your question. But you can get it. And the other thing, of course, is canon for the content generation. If you're generating content and you want to have like your NPCs talking, this is actually one of the research papers where they actually put a bunch of actors within a game-like environment, and there's a whole bunch you can read up on this kind of content generation. And another thing that's really useful is documentation, because as a game designer, nobody reads your documentation. I don't care how well they're written, I don't care how well they're organized, people just don't like to read stuff. But you can get the model to summarize things, you can get it to critique stuff, retrieve data, improve suggestions, and onboarding. But there's one more thing, search. Because one of the things is, when people look at your documentation, often they're like, I don't understand this, let me just ask you. And I'm like, I wrote this thing, it's out there on the documentation, why don't you just look it up? And they're like, no, but I need to understand it. On the other hand, you could just check the model and say, was this even written down there? And what do you think this might be about? And it's only when they go the next step, where you need to iterate on what's in the documentation. OK, let's talk about that, because it's not written yet. Maybe we haven't even thought about it. That's a good way to verify things. And next up is testability. Because if you're having known acceptance criteria in the test cases, and you want to test performance optimization or compatibility, all this stuff in testability, AI is very useful. And you don't just use a language model for that. You've got a whole bunch of other models that you can access. So in conclusion, I would say, be the expert. Now, of course, we'll go, oh, AI is going to take your jobs. So I say, no. The humans who are experts, who know how to use the AI, are going to take your jobs. That's going to happen. That's your competition today. So remember, with the knowledge tractor, what this really means is that you've got a machine that does knowledge work, and humans can use that to become extremely powerful. So know what the value drivers are in your business, prioritize the use cases and success metrics. You must be really good at what you do, simple as that. And we do a lot of painful stuff. So these days, let the tractor do the painful stuff. Figure it out. Because what if we break the tool chain? You want to take your infrastructure within game dev, you'd have an inference to be able to get models that are custom built for the application within your organization, and you're going to innovate. Because you're going to get a bunch of features, and those are the things that are going to help carry the day in our age of efficiency. So yeah, that's it for the talk today. And if you have any questions.
Thank you, Nickole, for this amazing talk. We have a lot of time for questions this time, so please with the first one.
Thank you for your presentation. So I am a backend developer myself, and in my experience, the AI is not ready yet to work with humans, right now. So in my experience, when you ask AI to do something, in the end, it will take equal or even more amount of time to double check after what this AI have generated for you. So even if you do it, even more if you would do it by yourself, by your hand. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, this is actually why I mentioned the inference part over there, because you need to have a model you can trust. And I do not trust the models that are out there right now. I can tell you that, and I see that you agree, because the reality is that hallucinations are very real with language models. And then there's also the matter of sometimes they are very context insensitive. So you try to get it to do one thing, and then it's doing something quite different. And if you're the expert, and you can catch this because you're the expert, you realize that, oh, it's better to just write this thing from scratch. And that makes perfect sense.
So do you mean that I need my own AI that I can train on my context to work with me? I cannot just use some ChatGPT because it's, contextless.
Yeah, I would say absolutely do not trust ChatGPT. There's a lot of reasons not to do so. So that's the one-liner down there. But training your own model, this is where things are actually quite challenging, because one thing I found is that across the board, in general, AI at the moment is not very good at context. So you can get it to write you a toy script. Why? Because it takes you longer to write the toy script, and it's a solved problem, and you can get an output from ChatGPT that's relatively, I wouldn't say reliable, but it's closer to the point. If you want anything sophisticated and you say, I want this, if, but, else, blah, 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 the moment you start giving that really big chunk of requests, what comes out is questionable. And that's why I would say that be careful of the use case. Very simple stuff, toy scripts. If you say, I've got 2 spreadsheets or 2 data tables that are exported, would you just diff those for me? Generally, it works okay, but you need to know how to verify. Because if you don't verify, you're going to be in trouble.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you.
Are there more questions?
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I'm not like a really experienced AI user right now, just low-key curious about it. And what I've been seeing on the internet is like 10 new AI tools that you can use, or 12 tools you can use for AI art, or 10 tools for this, or 10 tools for that. And right now we know that the most popular tools like ChatGPT cannot be totally trusted. And I have no clue, honestly, how does one train their own model. And if you could give any advice on where to start on this journey, because as a game designer, I would love to get some handiwork sorted, of course. Any entry-level tips in that regard would be very appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, the space is moving very quickly, but I can tell you one great thing. I don't think there are any experienced AI users out there today. Or to be precise, generative AI specifically, because we are all actually experienced AI users. We use Google, YouTube, and all that, so we're experienced already at the user level, right? But then when you're talking about having AI models, this is where things get very tricky, because there is most of the time, you're not training a model from scratch. So you cannot necessarily tune its exact behaviors, but you can tune, there are a couple of variables you can often have, like you can talk about weights, temperature. There are ways to fine-tune how the model is working, but the main issue you're going to have is, in the current way that we are training models, there's going to be a lot of raw data that you use as the input. So on the input side, if the data is not trustworthy or if it's from questionable sources, when I say questionable, like potentially copyrighted sources and all that, we start having some potential legal trouble, which is actually being showcased in the industry. But what I would say is, if you want to get into it, right now the space is moving very quickly. Use things off the shelf. You don't have to train your own model if you're not an AI developer. If you're a user, what happens is learn to use. Like, use various models. You don't have to go deep. And the reason you don't have to go deep is within 2 months, whatever model you've used probably has 5 new versions, and then there's a new game in town. So the rate at which the space is moving is so fast, you should not need to aspire to become an expert in any individual model. What happens instead is you say, this is what an LLM does. This is what the new models types are going to be doing. You start figuring out, you say, oh, what does Sora do? What does ChatGPT do? What does Google's, their latest, which one was it? Gemini, I believe. What do they do? So you just figure out what these things are about, and especially go a bit deeper. Figure out the parts where you're talking about the training of the models and why, as a result, there are inherent weaknesses to the output. So once you figure that out, I think that's about as much knowledge as you need, as opposed to being a developer. Because the developers, that rabbit hole goes really, really deep. But I would say just to stay abreast of it, because why? When you go to work in a company, sometimes the company will come up with either a really silly suggestion, in which case you go, I don't want to use this thing because reasons, or this is a great idea, this is how I can apply it to across the tool chain within this company. Or you say, hey, if you all have the capability of training your own model, this is how we might want to guide the training of a model so that the inference is done right. You have the infrastructure to back it up, and you have the innovation where you're applying that at a user level so that your company's productivity is improved. But at this point, I would say the big boys probably have the game at the moment. They are going to integrate AI into the various enterprise tools that already exist, and you'll probably encounter them at a user level at first. And that's where you just figure out, oh, like back in the day when Photoshop first came up, you were going, oh, we'll never trust photos ever again. That was true for some time. And then after that, it became just a standard tool within the tool chain. And I would think that the same thing's going to happen with AI. So right now it's like, oh, we'll never trust outputs ever again, and it's going to be true. But later on, it'll be like, now video creation is so much easier, graphical creation, the sketches are so much easier, so on and so forth. Those things will happen, but that's a bit further down the road where we can even use that at a release level, because I seriously doubt that's going to happen in the immediate term, unless people are misusing, basically.
We still have time for one last question.
Thank you for the great speech. I saw a slide, you were pitching your idea to the ChatGPT and asked for the criticism. So the question is it useful, and how do you use other AI as your game design daily job? Thank you.
Yeah, one of the strangest things I do for game design sometimes is I take the document in and say, how's my phrasing? Because there are a whole bunch of things that are solved problems, and language is one of them, and a language model is inherently good at that sort of thing. So that's one of the things you can definitely use it for. Another one is basically summarizing what you have basically been talking about. So like this entire talk, if we got the transcript and you summarized it, you probably will get something that I wouldn't say it's like excellent. I would say it's about 80% of where you want to get to, but that might be enough if you want to get a summary. And when it comes to game design, another thing that tends to happen is I would say, okay, I'm trying to come up with a new game system, and in this game system, what other similar games might there be out there? What would this be most similar to? So what happens here is you can start using it as a way to point to other solved problems. And I keep using the word solved problem because I don't think the models at the moment, and especially ChatGPT, are great at innovating. I think they are really good at looking up stuff that already existed. So what you can do is use it as a way to point you to things that have already been done. And then you say, oh, okay. Because that's something that you often ask an experienced developer, and you say, hey, does this sound like any other game you know of? Or you ask a gamer, and they'll say, yeah, it totally sounds like this thing from 1994. This is something you can use to look up. And it actually does it better than Google could, because Google will return you stuff maybe from Reddit or from some random source that might be AI generated these days. You cannot entirely trust that particular output. But what you can say is, oh, you mentioned this is like similar to Helldivers 1. Okay, great, I'll look that thing up, and so on and so forth. So that's what I would do for game design, basically.
All right, thank you very much. A great round of applause for Nickole.